So that's probably a good segue for me, because most of my customers are not vegan is a great segue for me, because I think about having a business that stays in business and that's sustainable and that's profitable. So my thinking about this when I came into this kind of presentation was, well, you want a good business. You want it to be up and running 5 years and 10 years down the track. And some of the things that I'll talk about are things related to that, rather than some of the ingredients or some of the other things that other people are going to talk about. I purely looked at the brand implications and some of the marketing communications things we might think about when we're thinking about putting a product into market. And I actually got some help from Nick Pontis, who's here, as a consumer psychology expert and a brand expert as well. And we discussed this a few times about what we would talk about. Some of the important things have already started to be talked about, which is the framing element of that, and others are around the consumer psychology and the consumer perception thing. So I wanted a discussion where we actually moved beyond the ideology, because consumers don't necessarily want to talk about the ideology. You might, and that's totally okay. And maybe that's where your passion comes from, and that's great. But the vast majority of your consumers are not necessarily thinking that way. So I'll talk about that after I talk about this. And this is where I see the market right now, which is really interesting when we actually talk about this market 10 years ago and the market today, is where you've actually got milk companies talking about a substitute product and asking them not to use the word milk. And you've got lamb ads that are taking the piss out of vegans. These are good things. These are actually great things, because what it does is expand your market discussion. So these are really good things. The other good thing about this is we've got restaurants, we've got delivery systems, we've got more entrepreneurs, we've got more brands, we've got supermarkets, all starting to play in this market because they understand that the market's getting bigger. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of the things that Matt spoke about, there's more of an understanding of the social implications about what we do in our food consumption, and that's fine. And we know globally that's increasing. We know there's changing attitudes toward this. We know that more people are aware of what actually goes into their food and how their food is actually produced. Now that affects their consumption behaviour. And we know that, and we know that the supermarkets are playing on that, and the food producers are playing on it. They know that. So they're already, the packaging, the ingredients, the types of products into the market are already changing. What you've got to be considerate of is your position. So your competitive advantage, you want to be the best at what you do, you want to have a unique position in the marketplace. That doesn't change. I can't talk about everything today, and if I was to go into a lot more depth, it would be about that, because I think you need to resonate with your consumers in how they see themselves. And I think a competitive advantage does that. I think there's certainly an acceleration around product development in the marketplace, and there's more innovation happening, which is a great thing. That's why we're all here today. But it's which bits of that are going to make sense for you as an entrepreneur, because you want your business to be going not just for 6 months. People can take up your product, they can use your product for 6 months, and they think it's really novel and really great. 6 months down the track, they're not buying the product anymore, and they've moved on to the next innovation. Okay, that's an issue that you do need to think about. We are behind. So in the US and the European markets, yes, there's a social conscious consumer, there's more awareness. The way in which I see it today in this market in Australia, we're almost at the start in many respects. The European market tends to be very ideologically driven. A very big difference in the US market. If you want to have a look at what might work here in the Australian market, might be pretty similar to what we see in the US market, where they're very defensive. It's a meat, driven type market, and that's a what I would say is a very staunch and stubborn attitudinal belief within that market, and the consumers to change or shift is going to be very difficult to do. The nudging element that we've been talking about today is really interesting, because it probably plays on what I would think is the right approach, which means that we can't necessarily do this. If you do this, what happens is you're conflicted. You know, your conflicted group, they stop. They don't tell me what to do. Australians hate being told what to do. Politicians love to tell people what to do, and they wonder why people hate them. That's why. We're individualistic. In other cultures, you talked about the Indian culture, and that's a collectivist ideology in their religion. It's based in their culture. In Australia, it's individualistic, and people are irreverent. We are irreverent. We take the piss. Our consumers here in Australia do not like being told what to do. There is a different approach. And what we think is that is a framing approach and how we have that discussion. It's not that we shouldn't have the discussion. It's just that we should frame that discussion differently. This is why this works in two different ways. This particular ad for Tourism Australia that's just gone out in the last few weeks, because in some senses, the US consumers are very similar to Australian consumers in that they don't like being told what to do. Okay, that's the irreverent nature of the individual consumer here. So the way in which I think you could reframe this, and this is me. I love running, and I watch what I eat. I'm very careful about, there's a few days of the week, and I eat meat, sorry, but a few days of the week, I'm eating clean. And most of my meals are actually vegetarian. And the reason for that has got nothing to do with the ideology related to animals. It's got everything to do with performance. Because I run 6 days a week, and I do probably another 4 strength sessions on top of that. My body needs good food. It needs really clean, most of the time, vegetables and fruits, non-stop. Okay, I would probably eat twice as much as most people because of that. And so I'm always looking for, not an alternative, I'm actually looking for good options. And the options for me are related to efficiency and performance, and that I feel light and fast. That's a different type of discussion then. And I'd have the same discussion with marathon runners, triathletes, bodybuilders. We all talk this talk. And it's a different type of discussion. So when we're packaging, when we're communicating, when we're actually looking at, how we think about the marketing communications related to this, it is a different discussion. It's about a benefit-driven type communication rather than the ideological. And there's nothing wrong with also having the ideological. But this is in balance with the product development and how it looks. Luke is right. We eat with our eyes. It needs to be beautiful. It needs to be packaged. It needs to be at the right price for people. They're making those decisions in the consumer behavior decision-making process. And it needs to be accessible. So I found a really good stat last year where the delivery on vegetarian-type dishes in the US has gone up by almost 1,000%. So what's the big change we've seen in the Australian market was Deliveroo, Uber Eats, etc. So it means it's more accessible. So you don't necessarily have to have the restaurant that sits there at South Bank and is open. You potentially could have a closed out system where you're actually cooking behind the scenes and use that, and it's packaged well, and you need the marketing comms and the digital websites and that show off your beautiful product, and you've got the social. But it's in balance. It's about a reframing. So I don't think I'm talking out of turn when actually we're probably talking very similar type discussions here, just in really different ways. So the reframe, looking at a more positive discussion with your consumers, because, as you said, a lot of your consumers, and sometimes the vast majority, are actually not vegan. So do you really then have to have the discussion? Well, you don't. You have a different type of discussion. You have a different type of communication. And you should allow your brand to be authentic in what it does, for sure, but not overpowered by the social agenda, okay? Because I think you might be missing your market. So my whole thinking about this was, well, how do you take your market from this and make it but still have the same product that you got? You're not really doing anything there, but your marketing communications and how you brand yourself and the brand associations related to that. So that definitely could be a better balance. The other thing I thought about too was you need to place your product in the consumer's life, in their daily life. So when you're communicating your product, you have them eating the product. Talk, here's our product, here's when you would eat it, here's when you'd have it with your family. You were talking before about having, a cheese platter. Or, you're having a barbecue, you'd have the cheese platter around and your family are eating around that. That type of discussion actually puts the consumer in the place of that context. It's a very different way to think about it. So we're not even talking about the social for the most part. That's a bonus. That's an easy sell. The post consumption, this also plays a role. So once what I would think in packaging is, when I was looking through for some examples, I saw the friend not food. You've seen that. I thought that was so great. If you haven't seen the friend not food, it's a cow's head and it's a friend not food thing. And I thought in your packaging, that's like a takeaway for consumers. Like, yeah, actually, I did make a good decision. That's a takeaway for a consumer, but it's not in their face. See the difference there? It's a reframe of how you might think about that. And that's my discussion. Thank you.